Hello and welcome to the Advanced Placement World History Podcast. This is episode 26, The Collapse and Recovery of Europe. When World War I broke out, nobody in the world thought of it as World War I. People obviously couldn't know that another world war was going to follow, so at the time, World War I was typically referred to as the Great War. Great because it was the most destructive war in history. The First World War is really a civil war between European powers, but it's important to keep the historical context in mind. In Unit 4, we looked at how by the end of the 19th century, the world was divided into European powers. Most of these European powers had colonies, so now when Europe goes toward the beginning of the 20th century, colonial people all over the world were pulled into the conflict. So, starting in the early modern period, which was Unit 3 or around the year 1450, up until the start of the 20th century, Europe was becoming more and more of a dominant power in the world, and by the turn of the 20th century, European powers ruled over most of the world through their empires. But Europe's rise to power didn't bring stability or unity to Europe. It was actually completely the opposite. And we've looked at Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, lots of competing states vying for power, and this trend continues throughout history leading up to World War I. And in many ways, the competition in Europe was just getting more and more intense with the unification of Italy and Germany. In the 1870s, we add two new major European powers. By the early 20th century, European powers had formed into two camps of alliances in order to protect themselves. And the belief among European states was that these alliance systems would create a balance of power and that this balance of power would maintain peace. So states are seeking out military alliance, but the main goal of these military alliances is to keep peace. On one side, you have the Triple Alliance, which was made up of Germany, Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the other side, you had the Triple Entente, which was made up of Russia, France, and Germany. So, if one country in an alliance is attacked, then the other countries have to come to its aid. So, if Britain was to go to war with Germany, for example, then France, Russia, Italy, and Austria would all have to go to war as well. So, what this really creates is an extremely volatile situation. And a word that is often used to describe this situation in Europe leading up to World War I is a powder keg, because it could explode easily with a small spark. At the time, the belief was these alliance systems would help keep the peace in Europe. So, the incident that sparked the powder keg happened in Serbia in June 1914. And Serbia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In Europe, this is a time of intense nationalism, and there's this movement in Serbia calling for independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, calling for the creation of a Serbian nationalist state. So we have a young guy in Serbia, only 19 years old, and his name was Gavrilo Principe, and he was part of a nationalist movement known as the Black Hand. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne visited Sarajevo. And this man was Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was generally a decent guy. He was well-liked, and he saw the threat of rising Serbian nationalism. He wanted to bring reforms to Serbia and give Serbians more independence within the framework of the existing empire. So you'd think the nationalists would see this as a good thing. But the way that Principe and the Black Hand saw this was that these so-called reforms were a threat to the dream of creating an independent Serbian nation. They were dangerous because basically they might make people content with the current situation and sort of stem the tide of rebellion. So, as Ferdinand was parading through Sarajevo, a Serbian nationalist threw a bomb at his carriage. It missed, but it exploded in the crowd and injured some people. But Ferdinand lived. But later in the day, Ferdinand was on his way to the hospital to visit the people who had been hurt in the attack, and with him was his wife Sofia. Here, Gavrilo Principe jumped into Ferdinand's carriage and shot Ferdinand, and he also ended up hitting his wife Sofia, who was pregnant. Sofia died on the spot, and Ferdinand died later in the hospital. Principe swallowed cyanide to kill himself, but it just made him throw up. He tried to drown himself in a nearby river, but the water was too shallow, so he ended up being caught. And he wasn't executed because the legal age to be executed was 20 years old, but he died in prison a few years later of tuberculosis. So we have a political assassination, but how does this assassination lead to the start of World War I? And basically, the Serbian independence movement had the support of Russia. Serbian people are Slavic, and Russia thought of itself as being the protector of Slavic people throughout the world. So through their Russian support, the Serbs were also indirectly allied with France and Great Britain. Austria was allied with Germany, which was much more powerful. Now, after the assassination, Austria moved into Serbia and cracked down on Serbian nationalism. When Austria moved into Serbia, Russia came to the help of the Serbs. Germany then came to the help of Austria, and when they did this, Germany passed through Belgium, which was supposed to be a neutral country. So the alliance systems essentially brought the countries of Europe into war with each other. So the alliance systems and the assassination of Ferdinand were the immediate causes of World War I, but there were more underlying factors here. One of these factors was nationalism. It was Slavic nationalism and the Austrian opposition that were at the heart of the conflict. And remember, this was the age of European nationalism and European racism. Schools, newspapers, mandatory military service all convinced millions and millions of Europeans that their national identities were better than other national identities. And the fact that all of these countries thought that they were better than the others meant that people were not very likely to compromise. Compromise would look bad. Why should we compromise with somebody else if we are the best? Another underlying factor was colonialism, specifically the competition for colonies between European powers. So the great powers of Europe were fighting intensely for colonies around the world, and this hostility carried over into Europe. A third factor was industrialization, specifically advancements of military industries. So by 1914, at the beginning of the war, all the big European powers had large standing armies and conscription or mandatory military service. We also see new industrial weapons being made, naval ships, submarines, tanks, airplanes, poisonous gas. So at the outset of the First World War, young men from all these countries who'd grown up with the belief that their nation was the greatest in the world really jumped at the opportunity to go to war. No matter the country, general sentiment was that the war would be very short, and young people wanted to be a part of it so they could share in the glory of victory. There were parades all over Europe, even in Canada, celebrating the start of the war, sending the young men to the front. And the governments ate this up. War was going to be a great thing. What better way than war to bring together a country and consolidate power? So it was strongly believed that the shared experience of going through a war would make the country stronger. Now, obviously, the war ended up being very different than what people had in mind. There were 10 million deaths, about 20 million crippled or disfigured people. Because of Europe's global reach, the war spread around the world. Troops and laborers from the colonies were brought into the conflict. There were battles in Africa and the South Pacific as British and French fought the Germans all over the world. Japan seized control of German possessions in China and the Pacific and placed their own demands on China. The Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of Germany, and World War I saw Arab revolts against Turkish rule in the Ottoman Empire. Canada joined the war in 1914 along with Great Britain, but the United States stayed out of the war until German submarines threatened American shipping routes. So, despite the fact that the war started in Europe, it clearly had a global impact, more of a global impact than any conflict that preceded it, so that is why it was called a world war. And the war completely shattered people's expectations. The expectation was that soldiers would be home by Christmas 1914, but the war grounded on and on and on until Germany was finally defeated in November 1918. Most of the fighting in World War I can be categorized as trench warfare, where opposing armies dig trenches along defensive lines trying to hold a position. And this type of fighting made for extremely long battles. Some battles lasted for months, and you read much more detailed accounts of the war through primary documents.